Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Our panelists are already lined up, so let's convene today's summit. And I promised you a panel of heavyweights, the creme de la creme, and I was not lying. Let me introduce our panelists for today. Dr. Hani Zubaydah, senior lecturer at the Israel Valley College, and of course the news anchor at the Israeli Knesset channel. Tal Schneider, political and diplomatic correspondent for the Times of Israel. And last but definitely not least, Mr. Amir Oren, defense and government commentator. Thank you all very much for joining our discussion today. And before we jump into the debate, our topic is, of course, the never-ending political drama here in Israel. Seemingly, the coalition dodging yet another bullet, managing to get back a resigning lawmaker. But if we're honest, it's just buying time at this point of the chain of events. So let's take a closer look, and we'll pick up the debate right after.
A teetering coalition and the prospect of another round of elections, as Meretz MK Ghaida Rinawie-Zoabi resigned from Israel's coalition on Thursday. After much convincing, she will now vote again with the ruling bloc. But the drama unveiled how fragile it all really is. Naftali Bennett's coalition is now back with just 60 votes out of 120 seats in parliament, meaning every dwindling lawmaker can tilt the entire scene anew. The government can theoretically survive as a minority. However, a bill to dissolve the Knesset, which needs support from 61 MKs, could force another election. Israel's fifth in under only 3 years. With Israel's political landscape shifting, is this ongoing crisis an inescapable consequence of proportional representation? Is Israel kicking the can down the road to re-elections? Are multi-party systems destined for failure?
So maybe it's not politicians to blame, but the multi-party system, is it doomed to fail? Gentlemen and dear lady, you know the rules. You each get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance, and we pick up the debate right after. So Dr. Zubaydah, take the lead.
Well, the answer is no, simply no, because back in the past we used to have a multi-party system as well, and there are other places in the world where you have a multi-party system and they're stable. The issue is, I think, the diversity of opinions in Israel and the fact that we move to the extremes. The center is small, the extremes are small, and then we don't have enough glue to stick us together. It has nothing to do with the multi-party system. It has to do with the public opinion, and the public can't be changed.
Well, yeah, you can't outvote the public at this point in time. At least, Tal, your take?
What is the question?
The question is whether the system itself, the multi-party system, is doomed to fail.
No, I don't think so. This is the system. It's not going to be changed anytime soon because, you can't change the system without a 61 votes. So this is what we have to stick with and make it work. And I don't think other systems will solve, basic problems of fragmented society. Any other system will still have the society. You don't get rid of the society itself.
Yeah, you get stuck with a society. That is a resonating message here. Amir, last but not least.
Well, one should understand that it is not a multi-party system per se, but national lists. And if you have another system, a bipartisan system, for instance, where there is a direct connection between the voter and the elected official, nevertheless, the fact that there are very few parties doesn't solve the crisis when the center doesn't hold.
Well, and in this respect, let's dive into the debate. And from this point onwards, please feel free to interact. I don't remember which philosopher was that said that once we realize that politicians are not solving our problems, but their problems will be better off. And in this respect, my question to you is, what's the difference between the lash out that lawmaker Rinawie-Zoabi, that is now returning to the embrace of the coalition, and the embrace that lawmaker Silman received for leaving the coalition among opposition, the opposition benches, of course. What's the difference here if they both did the same thing for their own, so to speak, agenda? Hani.
Well, there's no difference. I think there's, one major difference. Ghaida Rinawie-Zoabi asked for some sort of benefits. She wanted to reap the benefits of her leaving the coalition, which wasn't really leaving the coalition. The sad part is that her party leader didn't know that this was the reason she was going for. But I think if we look at it in a general way, Benjamin Netanyahu had a 61 coalition as well. This coalition is now 60, back in the day 61. The only difference is the ideological glue. While Benjamin Netanyahu had the right to himself, now what we see is a coalition that is extremely spread on the continuum of left and right. And I have to add one thing. In political science, we have a law. Minimum winning coalition is probably the best coalition. Why? Because they reap the most benefit with the least issues. This coalition is an exception to that rule due to the diversity of ideology. And I think if we look at Silman and Zoabi, this is exactly the diversity that brings this coalition to the brink of failure time and time again.
And Tal, if there was one thing this coalition sought to do from its very onset, was to differentiate between politics and policy as much as possible in order to maintain this very hybrid, eclectic consistency. But it appears to be like a double-edged sword here, because those departing lawmakers are leaving the coalitions and going back to it because of policy. So can policy and politics be kept apart?
So it's not really policy. I mean, this is just, I don't think Zoabi actually, such a big policymaker or, we should judge her on the merits. She's just a very small politician who were looking for her own benefits, felt like things are going to fall apart, and she wanted to make a name for herself for these 72 hours, and maybe if the government and the Knesset collapses, so someone may remember her in the Arab society. Just very small games, very small politics. I think Silman on the other side played small politics as well. Both women have a statement contrary to what they just said in the last year. So they were, they had, statements supporting this wonderful government, and suddenly, out of the sudden, they just flipped. I don't buy it. I think it's just very small politics. But the difference is that in Yamina, for Idit Silman, she has other options. And Yamina, as a party, if this party will ever survive, they will probably sit in any kind of government in the future. Whereas Meretz is just standing into this one-time government, and they will not have any other chance. So this is their only government, and probably they will go back to the opposition immediately when after this government will fall. So they don't have, for Meretz it's a devastating event, whereas for Silman it was just like, blossom and happiness, everybody who wants to take her.
Right, but Amir, what's the incentive of all lawmakers essentially within the coalition now not to play this extortion game? If the coalition is just buying time, each and every one of them can now make great headlines for herself.
Well, in this sort of a deadlock, the 60-60 balance that you have, most coalition members of Knesset, if they are not cabinet ministers, have to be frustrated because they are not real people. They are only fingers. They are only there to be counted. Their only chance to make headlines and perhaps capitalize on their advantage is when they bolt or threaten to bolt over to the other side. But this is very short-sighted, because once they make the move, they see that there are hurdles on the way to the opposition, and they are trying to go back. Silman went back to her faction meeting and was ousted. It was quite embarrassing, the way she tried to go back to her party caucus. And now Zoabi, who said that she is beyond the point of no return, returned.
Well, a very flexible point, let's put it that way. So this jigsaw puzzle truly undermines the mere notion of separation of powers, right? Because echoing what you've just mentioned, Amir, we're seeing ministers resigning as lawmakers in order to become ministers and vice versa. So the entire game becomes political survival and political survival only, no?
Yes, but under the Netanyahu government, there was no separation of powers. The government was the Knesset. You didn't have legislative oversight or overruling cabinet decisions. It was all Netanyahu, channeled through the Likud and its partners. This time around, there is at least some lively debate, and we will see it tomorrow and Wednesday. Probably in the two occasions when the bill, which will give stipends to students who come from the military, comes up for a vote, and then perhaps for the bill calling for early elections.
But is it really that different, Dr. Zubaydah? Is that the change this change government vowed for?
Well, first I disagree. We don't see any separation of power. This is not a separation of power in a parliamentary system where the government is the majority of the legislator, the parliament, Israeli Knesset. There's no separation of power. And if we might think about the Supreme Court in Israel, which is under attack, constant attack and distress, separation of power doesn't really exist. But for the matter of fact, when we talk about the Israeli Knesset today, what we see is a problem, because most of the ministers resign from the Knesset under the Norwegian law, which we call, and you don't see them in the parliament. They don't vote in the parliament, don't forget. And now what we see is not a separation of power. We see a separation between the executive and the legislative, which creates a huge disperse between the Knesset and the government. And that wasn't the case in the Netanyahu era, because he managed to hold on to those things. And I should add, the problem in the current Knesset, adding to the political aspect, is a personal aspect. We see an extremely problematic management of people. Naftali Bennett failed in managing his people in his party. He has 2 deserters. And now we see Meretz, which didn't solve the first issue with Ghaida Rinawie-Zoabi, and now is facing a second problem with her. So what we see is kind of like a combination of a huge spectrum ideologically within one coalition. We see a problem of separation between the legislator and the executive branch, and we see a poor management of people, which everything boils down to the fact that we see this coalition going from one extreme failure to another extreme failure, and in a distress, in a constant distress.
And echoing that, before we take a short break, Tal, perhaps if we connect a line here, primary elections or lack thereof, all those quote-unquote troublemakers come from parties without primary elections, meaning they don't have to report back to an immediate electorate. Maybe this is the root of the problem?
Yeah, I think this is a huge problem. Zoabi, she has no engagement with Meretz voter base. She doesn't know them. She doesn't owe them anything. And on top of that, she made no sweats in order to be in the Knesset. I mean, she was civil society activist, but she made no sweats nothing unlike people who are sweating their way through party conferences and party chapters all around the country. So, what comes easy goes easy. That's the phrase. So she was willing to waive on and everything. What?
Yeah,